Greetings from Lancaster Theological Seminary. I feel like I know this congregation because it has sent me so many wonderful students. I must confess, though, that I was a bit taken aback when Pastor Pam asked me to talk about sex, because I vividly remember the inadequacy of my own the birds and the bees conversation with my father. I was about 7 years old and noticed that my parents made references to events that I could not remember, like World War II and the election of Harry Truman. So I asked about this gap in my memory, and my father, who was a devout Baptist, explained that I had not been born into the family yet. Evidently, I realized there had been a time when I had not been with the family. Deeply puzzled, I asked, "How did you get me? Where did I come from?" Then he looked very uneasy. After a long pause, he said, "You've seen the hospital, right?" "Well, inside the hospital is a room sort of like the frozen food section in the supermarket. You know, where you look at the food through a glass window. And that is where people go to get their babies." Now, that made sense to me because I had often seen my parents engaging in comparative shopping in the frozen food counters. So I inquired further. There were lots of babies to choose from, right? Still looking uncomfortable, my father muttered, "Well, yes." And that led to my final question. "So which of my many adorable traits led you to pick me instead of the other options?" And at this point, my father realized that his little fiction had proceeded a little too far, and he began to explain to me where babies really come from. Even as a child, I could sense his high level of discomfort. But most of what he said, I did not understand anyway. My father's squeamishness was not unique. And it wasn't just a cultural thing from the 1950s. It's partly a Christian thing. Through the centuries, Christians have been exceedingly reluctant to talk about sex, except maybe in negative terms to condemn particular behaviors. They'll talk about murder, greed, political corruption, financial irregularities, international crises, but not about sex. Now, I think the reasons for this embarrassment are multiple, and they're rooted in our theologies. For one thing, in the history of the church, many Christians have identified sex with the transmission of original sin. In this view, even within the bonds of matrimony, there's something sinful and sinister about sex. And this connection of sex and sin goes way back. In the ancient church, in the 5th century, the great theologian Augustine proposed that during intercourse, the partners get so passionate that the heat warps the embryo. And not just the embryo's physical material, but also the embryo's soul. So the soul ends up deformed, twisted, and corrupt, prone to sin, because it was overheated when it was conceived, like turning up the temperature on the microwave. In the Middle Ages, Christians believed that every time a person has sex, it does damage to the internal organs due to overexcitement, and God subtracts a day from that individual's lifespan. To modern Protestant ears, this theory might just seem weird. But behind it lies a suspicion that there's something frighteningly powerful and dangerous about sexual urges. The instincts can seem so urgent that people in the grip of them may seem out of control. Think of rock songs that compare sex to a raging river. And often, sex is portrayed in the Bible as an almost irresistible force that masters people and leads them to do things that are stupid and grossly immoral. The Bible is populated with stories about people like King David, who lusts after Bathsheba so much that he basically rapes her and has her husband Uriah killed. And remember Samson, who gets captured and blinded by the Philistines because he cannot control his desire for Delilah. I used to live across the street from a college fraternity, and one of the brothers, for some reason, befriended me and used to brag about his erotic exploits. Now, I expressed dismay at his cavalier attitude towards women. In defense, he explained that he had just learned in his evolutionary biology class that males have an inherent drive to spread their genetic code as widely as possible, something which helps propagate the species. So he claimed that his biological instincts were too powerful to be resisted. And in his self-justifying way, he was articulating a prevalent theme. We're all slaves of our sexual passions. And in light of this sensibility, many Christians have concluded that sex is a supremely dangerous and destructive force that can lead to compulsive behavior, violence, and abuse. And so it has often been preached that in regard to sex, just have as little to do with it as possible. And there have been other motivations for the suspicion of sex. Another very influential one's really simple. It's just this: people like sex too much. And therefore, sexual gratification can become one of an individual's major goals in life. In other words, it can become an idol, something we worship. And because it is so enticing, it can even become an addiction. People say to themselves, if only I were sexually fulfilled, all would be well with me. I would be absolutely content and happy. And to tell the truth, that's the way our culture often presents sex. Sexual gratification forms the plot line of innumerable movies and is celebrated in every genre of pop music, from country and western to hip hop. Consequently, sex has been associated by Christians with all the other temptations that can become our ultimate goals. It's up there with the pursuit of money and power. In other words, sex has been classified as one of the main worldly things that can cause us to turn our backs on God. I had a secular friend in college who said, first, I want to make sure that I have all the money and sex that I need, and then, if I have any time and energy left over, I'll worry about loving my neighbor. So no wonder some Christians have gone cold turkey and advocated celibacy. That's why in the Middle Ages, the Catholic priesthood concluded that ministers of Christ should resist all sexual activity, for sex distracts us from the more important task of loving God with all our heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbors as ourselves. And there's yet another motivation why Christians shy away from sex. And it's this: maybe it's just too darn physical. Sex reminds us that we have bodies, just like other animals. And that can make us feel vulnerable, because bodies have blemishes and bulges. Bodies can get sick and break down. They get old, wrinkled, and stop working. Every morning, I find more hair on my pillow, and I realize it's not on my head anymore. And eventually, our bodies die. So it's not surprising that many Christians have advocated a sharp differentiation of the body and the spirit. and conclude, the body and its pleasures and delights do not matter, for bodies pass away. Only the spirit is eternal. And so it's best to ignore the fact that you have a body. But most Christians haven't rejected sexuality entirely. They reason, you can't expunge it, but maybe you can control it and put it to good use. So in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church made a major concession to sexuality. You need it in order to produce more Catholics. And that theme has its roots in the Old Testament. The people of Israel wanted children, and lots of them, so that their tribes would become more numerous and they would have more reinforcements for their armies and more hands to harvest the crops. So Christianity has often had a dim view of sexuality. That's the bad news. But there's good news. In the Bible itself, there is another trajectory. In this dimension of Scripture, sexuality is seen as a gift of our extravagantly generous Creator. God looked upon the created order in Genesis and declared it to be good. All of it. The plants are good, the animals are good, and human beings are good. Look at the story of Jesus at the wedding in Cana that we just heard read. Jesus, by his very presence, is blessing a ritual to celebrate a marriage. And bless the festivities that are part of that celebration in very earthly ways. He turns water into wine so that the party won't wind down. And throughout his parables, Jesus uses bride and bridegroom images, all pointing to how excited and joyful the bridegroom is for the upcoming nuptials. And Jesus would not have used the metaphor of a wedding night for Christian faith if he had not thought there was something wonderful about wedding nights. And Paul, the apostle, uses wedding and intimate marriage metaphors all the time. The church is the bride of Christ, and the wedding will be consummated. But the Old Testament sometimes goes overboard with the celebration of sexuality. The Song of Songs is sexuality on steroids. When I was a teenager, my pious grandmother exhorted me to read the Bible from cover to cover. But then she reflected a moment and added, but don't read the Song of Songs. Skip that one. So, of course, that was the book I read first. And I was shocked. From beginning to end, this biblical book is an exuberant ode to the joy of sex. It lovingly delights in the details of the beloved's body. Its metaphors for the beloved's physical charms are over the top and unrestrained, eyes like doves, limbs like ivory tusks, a bag of nard. I didn't know what a bag of nard was when I was a kid, but I thought it was probably something my grandmother didn't want me to know about. Now, portions of the Bible like this portray sex almost as a sacrament of interpersonal intimacy. And that makes sense. Because when we are with our partner, we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. All our physical flaws are on display. And that is an exercise in interpersonal trust. And interpersonal trust is something we desperately need, not only in regard to one another, but in regard to God. And sex at its best can be a ritual of mutual delight in which the barriers between the partners begin to evaporate. The pleasure isn't mine or yours, but ours. The joy given can be the same as the joy received. So sex can be a language of reciprocal affirmation and care. And even more than that, it can become a symbol of God's love. In rare but wonderful moments, it can even be a channel of reconciling grace. So yes, my father's reluctance to have the birds and the bees talk was not unusual. It has a long pedigree in the history of the church. And yes, the Bible and Christian theology have been rightly suspicious of all the misuses of sex that humanity has devised. It can disrupt families and communities, it can spawn violence, it can generate abuse, it can become a person's idol, and it can encourage an obsessive concern for our bodies or a disregard for them. All that is true. Sex is potentially dangerous. But nevertheless, sexuality remains part of the goodness of the created order. God created us with bodies for a reason. The central tenet of Christianity is that in Jesus Christ, God came to humanity in the flesh, not a spirit, not a ghost. It's crucially important in the New Testament that Jesus had a body. To prove it, the resurrected Christ displayed his wounds to his disciples and munched on fish with them. He was no disembodied spirit. And if Jesus' body was good and crucially important, then the bodies of Jesus' sisters and brothers are good and crucially important. And so, yes, the final word is that the birds and the bees are among the things that God, the Creator, declared to be very good and to be treasured, preserved, and enjoyed. Amen.